Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out for this. I have the pleasure of introducing César before he takes the stage, and I'll do it quickly so mostly you can spend your time hearing from him. So César is a professor at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law, and among other classes, he teaches immigration law and criminal procedure. But that's only one interesting thing about him. César is also somebody who's really one of the leading scholars of migration and definitely of immigration detention in the country. He is somebody who's really setting the conversation. And so you might see his work in the New York Times or in The Guardian and in other places. And he's setting the conversation on immigration detention and on more broadly, the intersection between criminal law and immigration law. So if you haven't checked out his blog, crimmigration.com, I encourage you to if you want to nerd out on those two intersections. He's in legal academia and beyond, he's somebody who I've been looking to really kind of shift us away from accepting the fact that immigration detention has to exist. And so, he's really just setting us up for thinking through why do we have immigration detention? Could there be a world where we don't have immigration detention? Could there be a world where we shut down the detention center down in Tacoma? So I'm a member of La Resistencia, which is fighting to do just that, and so I encourage you all to join our campaign to shut down the NWDC. If you want to raise your hand if you're with the NWDC, with La Resistencia, talk to us afterwards and we can sign you up to our campaign after you were inspired by César. His book, Migrating to Prison, America's Obsession with Locking Up Immigrants, is a really accessible, which I can tell you as an immigration law practitioner and professor is not an easy thing to do with immigration law or policy, but it's a super accessible look at the persistence of immigration detention and how it's increasingly enmeshing with other forms of punishment. It tells us what's new about this moment and what isn't new to the Trump era, and it makes a very brilliant case for abolition of immigration detention is really the only humane or logical alternative. But I'll stop telling you about it and let César do that, and thank you all again for being here.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for joining me. Thank you, Angelica, for that lovely introduction. I think that the answer is to her question is can we have a world without immigration prisons? The answer is yes. And so I think that's the abridged version. But I am going to keep you for a little longer, just so that you can get your $5 worth. So for me, this story that I tell in Migrating to Prison, America's Obsession with locking up immigrants is one that stems from my own personal lived experience of migration that is in many ways a story of my family, like it's a story for families of many of you who are here tonight. So I was born and raised in McAllen, Texas. It's a city in southeastern Texas, a few miles north of the Rio Grande River. And I mentioned that because, of course, the river is the waterway that brought people to this region. It's a hot place. It's a semi-arid place. It's a difficult place in which to make a life, and yet it is and so because of that difficulty, the waterway is why people settled there, and that happened long before that same waterway transformed into the U.S.-Mexico border. My family straddled the formal international boundary between these two countries. My parents' work did so as well. The births of my siblings did, and of course, for much of my life, my daily existence did as well. For us, border crossings were absolutely routine. They were just a routine, ordinary facet of life. This happened for family visits. We crossed the border to go shopping, to go to medical appointments, to see doctors. We had very much a binational, a bicultural, a bilingual family. We still do. That was at once in two worlds, and yet at the same time, we were also living a very singular experience. It is the distinct experience of a life in the borderlands. So there in South Texas, my parents managed to raise 5 kids. I'm the youngest of 5. So 5 kids in a migrant farm worker housing project. And they did so in the way that many other families managed to get by scrimping and by scrounging. So we recycled cans, aluminum cans, not for the environmental benefits. We recycled cans for cash. We would get money that our family needed. We would stand in line at the housing project when the trucks would come from the county government, bringing surplus government cheese and surplus government peanut butter, and that was normal. Right? We didn't know any other way of doing things, and much of that can be explained by the fact that my parents didn't have much by way of formal education. My father finished high school in Texas. My mother finished the 3rd grade in the small town in the Mexican state of Querétaro in central Mexico that she was born in, that she was raised in. She went through the 3rd grade because that was it. That was the extent of school that existed in her little village. And in our family mythology, she actually went to 3rd grade twice, and it wasn't because she was doing poorly. It was because she liked it so much. She didn't want to stop going to school, but when 3rd grade is all you can get through, well, she was able to convince her father to allow her to stay for an extra year. And so my parents didn't have much formal education, but I still don't know whether it's despite that or whether it's because of that. But for them, education for their kids was absolutely everything. They filled my mind, they filled my siblings' minds with the ambition for learning that they had, but that they had been unable to fulfill formally for themselves. And so they prepared me to thrive in worlds that I didn't know existed, that I think that they didn't know existed. And so when I left that in-between space of the borderlands, ni de aquí, ni de allá, it's often said, I found myself startled and entirely unmoored in the imposing halls of the university that I was attending, Brown University in Rhode Island. The extent of I love Brown, but the extent of wealth and the different cultural norms and expectations were absolutely jarring. So unfamiliar that I think at times I didn't realize that I was out of place. That was how much I was out of place. And yet I got through that, and eventually I managed to find myself in law school, and again I was disoriented once again by that experience, and yet I found the courage to keep moving forward, to keep evolving as a person and growing as a student in that childhood of crossing boundaries. It was through those experiences, far away from the South Texas community that initially breathed life into me, that I came to see what was not apparent to me as a child. So as a kid, knowing no other way of life, I had been unable to see the power of that border over the bodies that dared to cross it. I did not know that the Border Patrol, that La Migra, was not an everyday feature of life, as experienced by most people in the United States, because it was an everyday feature of life, as experienced by most people in my life. I did not know that checkpoints an hour north of the border, would raise eyebrows outside of the region. I did not know that there was anything strange about the occasional tío sleeping on a couch in our living room because he was trying to make his way back to his job somewhere up north. In short, I did not realize the power that the law had on my daily experience, on the experience of others in my community, until I found myself outside of that familiar space and managed to, and had the opportunity to reflect on where it is that I'd been. But there was one facet of South Texas that continued to remain hidden from my view until I actually returned to the region as a newly minted lawyer, with a shiny new bar card in hand. And I went back so that I could join my brothers in representing migrants, both of whom are older, I like to point out, but both of whom are relevant to you are SU grads. I have a family of three SU law grads, my two brothers and one of my sisters-in-law. So a familiar, I'm in a familiar family environment at the very least. And so I went back to South Texas to join my two brothers in the work of representing migrants who were facing deportation proceedings. And once I started doing that work, I learned of this facet of life in South Texas that had previously been unknown to me. And that is the experience of, or the existence of immigration prisons. So all of a sudden, I found myself representing clients in detention centers that I hadn't known existed. Sometimes they were surrounded by onion fields, like stinky onion fields that go on forever. Sometimes they were surrounded by wildlife refuges, gorgeous natural environments. But they were always remote, even by South Texas standards. And so these prisons were housing incarcerated individuals, and it turns out they'd been there all along. Only I'd been completely unaware of that. So in effect, they had been, for me at least, hidden in plain sight. Now, I remember vividly the very first time that I drove to one of these facilities, the Port Isabel Detention Center, which is about 1,500 beds, and it's been around since the mid-1980s. As I drove there on a small 2-lane road that I'd never been on before, I actually pulled over at one point just to admire the scenery. There were these native bamboos growing out of a series of small lakes. There were these gorgeous white birds that were perched along the edge. They're egrets, I now know, but I didn't know that at the time. And so in the 2 decades or so that I'd lived in South Texas before then, I'd never seen anything like this. This is a part of the region that's actually really, I now know, is actually really well known outside of the region. It's actually an important part of the local economy because a lot of people from places like this, from the Midwest, other parts of the United States, go down there to look at the birds. It's a wildlife refuge that's famous for being a nesting area, a resting stop for migratory birds that are heading back and forth from Central America in particular. But I'm not a birder. And I don't know any birders. I still think I don't know. I don't know any birders even now. I definitely didn't know anyone who was doing any birding back when I was growing up. So I stopped to look at this and was absolutely stunned by what I saw. But I had an actual job to do, so I had to get back in the car. And so I did, and I continued along my way, and I didn't stop again until I reached the guardhouse at the entrance to the Port Isabel Detention Center. Fencing surrounds the imposing concrete walls of what is a series of prison buildings. You go through one security checkpoint just to get into the parking lot, and then another to enter the facility. And once you do that, once you get past the second layer of security checkpoints, then you're inside, and there are steel doors, and there are surveillance cameras watching everything, and there are escorts. And then there's a cinder block visitation room where the rare attorney meets with clients. And I say rare attorney because in immigration court, there is no right to government-appointed counsel, which means if you're lucky enough to find somebody to work for free, great. And if you're not, then you need to find the money to pay for someone like me. Right? And most people who were locked up there were not so fortunate. So it's not because of anything I brought to the table. It's simply because most people simply didn't have the money to hire a private attorney, and so they were going through the process completely by themselves, the process of trying to find a legal basis to stay in the United States. So that was then, and now I'm privileged to call myself, I'm still a lawyer, I'm a law professor, I'm a teacher, I'm a writer. I've written for more than a decade about the ever-growing intersection between criminal law and immigration law, about the criminalization of migrants themselves and of migration. And people often ask me, well, how long have you been working on this book? And the honest answer is that I can't really tell you because I don't know. I'm not trying to keep anything from you. I actually just don't know. The idea for the book probably started on that drive to the Port Isabel Detention Center. And more fundamentally, started when I was a child. And in my view, my child's eye view, the law was nothing more than the power of the Border Patrol to decide who could live with their families, to decide who could go to work or go to school. So I think that it's accurate to say that as long as I have been doing this work, as long as I have lived this work, I've had this book in mind somewhere, even if it didn't look like a book. So incarceration is just the harshest reality of this trend. It's the part of immigration policing that led to the death of a gentleman named Kamyar Samimi. 40 years in the United States and a green card in his hand. And I showed up at his door one day and took him down to a private immigration prison in suburban Denver, in Aurora. And 2 weeks later, he was dead. And the government's press release said that he died suddenly. The government's internal investigation report, released over a year later and only after a journalist filed an open records request, that investigation report said that the prison's doctor never bothered to see Mr. Samimi. And it added that the nurses at the facility did not follow the doctor's instructions about how to care for Mr. Samimi. So immigration prisons are the places where the government, where our government, where we, the people, oversee suffering, where quality of life suffers, and indeed where at times life goes to end. And for those reasons, I have concluded that immigration prisons are not defensible. In this book, Migrating to Prison, I trace how the United States once shut down its immigration prisons and how for 25 years after that, life went on without them. And I also describe how starting in the late 1970s, the United States built the largest immigration prison system in the world. Today, the United States locks up roughly 500,000 people every year because the government thinks that they violated immigration law. In immigration prisons, there are people held under the power of what lawyers call civil law, because the government says that they might not belong here. And then there are people held under the power of criminal law, because the government wants to punish them for having come here. Today, immigration prisons are everywhere, and they take just about every form. From an old motel that I visited in Tucson to a 1,400-bed concrete fortress alongside a Superfund site in Tacoma. Some people are there because the government wants to strip them of permission to be here. Take Jerry Armijo, who I spoke to when I was writing this book. Raised in South Texas, not far from where I grew up. We were both born into a poor, overwhelmingly Mexican community in South Texas. Only I was born north of the Rio Grande River, and he was born on its southern side. So I was born a U.S. citizen, and he was not. And after high school, I went off to the Ivy League, and he joined the army and went off to Iraq. So I was being shocked by a different culture, and he was getting shocked by bombs. And when he returned with a leg injury and psychological trauma, he didn't get the support that he needed. And so like many people have done before him, he fell into drugs and eventually into the criminal justice system. And one day, ICE picked him up and sent him to a local immigration prison and started the process of trying to deport him. One bomb, a shoddy mental health care system, and a few bad decisions, and all of a sudden, Jerry turned from being a war hero to being what politicians like to call a criminal alien. And still others are locked up because they dared to seek safety in the United States. Federal law is clear that if you are in this country and you are afraid for your life, then you can apply for asylum. It does not matter where you came from. It does not matter how you got here. And yet, coming to the United States without the federal government's permission is also a federal crime. So this is why in the summer of 2018, we saw federal officials taking parents from their kids. Children were being sent off to places like this old motel in Tucson that's surrounded by tall fencing. It's monitored by 24/7 security cameras. And meanwhile, the parents were being prosecuted. And before then and since then, kids have been confined alongside their parents. Kids like Diego Rivera Osorio. When he was just 1 year old, Diego's mother, Wendy, decided that life in Honduras was too dangerous for them to stay. And so like people from all over the world have done for generations, Diego and Wendy turned to the United States for safety. They came here and they asked for asylum. And within a few days, they found themselves in an old nursing home outside of Philadelphia that ICE calls a family residential center. Well, critics call it a baby jail. Diego and Wendy were stuck. They can't leave. They couldn't leave. Inside that old nursing home, waiting for the legal process to slowly grind forward. Remember, he was just 1 when he arrived. Diego was 3 by the time he got out. And eventually, he won his legal case to stay in the United States, but not before 650 nights had passed. I tell the story of Diego in the book, and I tell the story of many other migrants who are caught up in one way or another in the immigration prison system. But in the book, I make the case that immigration prisons are not just inhumane. They're also created to serve purposes that many of us would not condone, even imagine. They're not about keeping us safe. They're not about promoting justice, and they're not about enforcing the law. They're about electing politicians and about fueling the profits of private prison corporations and of local economies. Now, these are not reasons to take away someone's liberty, anyone's liberty. To give you a little bit of context about the political underpinnings of the immigration prison system that we rely on so heavily today, let me read a passage from the book that takes us back to 2014, November 2014, the Obama era. In a primetime immigration speech on November 20th, 2014, President Obama explained that his administration's immigration enforcement priorities target felons, not families, criminals, not children, and gang members, not a mom who's working hard to provide for her kids. Well, President Obama's exhortation is as good as an example as President Trump's trite comment about targeting bad hombres. And I've been preparing. I've tried to mimic the way his pronunciation. I can't do justice to it. So just bad hombres. Both of these simplify complex human beings. Felons are part of families, just like one person's bad hombre might be another's father. It hurts that he was trying to be a dad and he can't, Cecilia Ekihua said about her father, locked up for returning to the United States to reunite with his kids. The easy sound bites make for politically useful talking points, but they're a lousy basis for public policy. The shifting sands of the political debate about which migrants deserve to live freely in the United States and which don't expose the pernicious edge of sorting the good from the bad. Listen to most elected officials talk about immigration, and one commonality quickly becomes obvious. Everyone, it seems, wants to lock up and deport criminals. President Clinton signed laws that made it easier to land in an immigration prison and harder to get out. His successor, President Bush, inaugurated the era of hardline criminal prosecution of immigration law violators. President Obama and his top immigration officials repeatedly claimed to focus their resources on so-called criminal aliens and oversaw the largest immigration prison population in history until then. The Trump administration is not different. In his first week as president, Donald Trump signed an executive order declaring aliens who engage in criminal conduct in the United States to be a particularly significant threat to national security and public policy. Despite the consistent bipartisanship of tarring migrants who have committed a crime, it's impossible to sort the good from the bad consistently. Obama's felons, not families remark categorized people into two boxes: family members on the one hand and criminals on the other. Trump uses two different categories: law-abiding citizens, almost always depicted as white, and law-breaking migrants, almost exclusively not white. Both categories are convenient rhetorical ploys that make for good sound bites, but neither can be defended logically. The criminals that Obama derided are also family members. Families include criminals, and criminals have families. Lots of crime, in fact, is committed against family members. Politicians and pundits inclined to dislike migrants have a sharp eye for their worst mistakes. When Iowa police pinned blame for the murder of white college student Molly Tibbetts on Cristian Baena Rivera, an unauthorized migrant from Mexico, Trump quickly stood in front of a camera and complained, "We have tremendous crime trying to come through the border." In Trump's view, crimes, not people, cross the border. By contrast, President Obama was the opposite of Trump's crudeness and callousness. Still, the Obama administration heavily publicized its policy of targeting migrants with criminal histories while going easy on people who had avoided blemishes. Even the DACA program was off limits to young people who had been convicted of some crimes. Trump's complaint is certainly cruder than the Obama administration's policy, but both examples fit into a broader bipartisan pattern. In political conversations, migrants are expected to be innocent. If they are not, they stop being in the good graces of policymakers and the laws they make. We love our victims innocent, writes the philosopher Mladen Dolar. We empathize with them as long as they appear to be innocent. But the moment they display some trait that is not entirely amiable, the sympathy is cut short. For U.S. citizens, blemishes are to be expected because humans are imperfect creatures. We mess up. President Trump expressed support for his campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, who admitted to lying to the FBI. He pardoned his supporter, Joe Arpaio, who was convicted of disobeying court orders. But he regularly harps on about the dangers that migrants pose. When it comes to the aliens who migrate to the United States, blemishes are red flags of which citizens should be wary. So this is a story, the story of immigration in prisons and how we got here, why we do this. Is certainly a story about politics. But it's also a story about money. For private businesses and local governments, immigration prisons are an attractive financial spigot. In 1 year alone, Congress spent $2.7 billion on ICE's detention system. The two largest private prison corporations in the United States, CoreCivic and the Geo Group, which runs the Tacoma facility, get about half of their revenue from the federal government. Now, to elected officials, a threat to their high employment private prison is quite often a threat to their reelection bids. Now, let me describe this relationship with another passage from the book that takes us to a rural part of New Mexico. Most days are quiet in Milan, New Mexico. The Wow Diner offers a 1950s throwback experience with red booths lining the U-shaped building. And the Kiva Cafe smothers its sopapillas in a red chili that screams New Mexico cuisine. If Milan's 3,000 residents want more options, they can jump on Interstate 40 and head an hour and a half east to Albuquerque. Unless they are locked up. Almost 40% of Milan's population lives inside the Cibola County Correctional Center, a monochromatic complex of beige buildings tucked behind the Wow Diner. Owned and run by CoreCivic, one of the two largest operators of private prisons in the U.S., for many years, the Cibola County Correctional Center held people convicted of entering the United States clandestinely, a federal crime. As convicted criminals, they were behind bars because they were being punished. Rings of concertina wire are stretched across the tops of 2 layers of fencing, leave a clear impression that punishment is the goal. In return for running the Milan prison, CoreCivic received a steady revenue stream from the Justice Department's Bureau of Prisons. Milan, meanwhile, came to value the prison's place in the town's slumbering economy. Roughly 300 locals work there. When the Bureau of Prisons announced in July 2016 that it would not renew its contract with CoreCivic, which at the time was actually called the Corrections Corporation of America, a shudder jolted the community. One resident, reflecting on the many prison employees that she knew whose livelihoods were suddenly at risk, boiled down her thoughts to this: it sucks. That was the summer of 2016, and when that happened, the federal prison agency's decision to cut off the Cibola County facility seemed like a death nail. Who would want to do business with a prison so problematic that the Bureau of Prisons had decided to sever its 15-year relationship? Seeing the imminent hit to employment rise ominously on the economic horizon, local officials and CCA executives sprung into action. The consequences of the BOP's decision were frightening. For some officials, that made the path forward unambiguous. My first option is for it to stay private because of the revenue the prison produces for the city of Milan, the local state senator, Democrat Clemente Sanchez, said. Well, before the month of October was out, Sanchez could breathe a sigh of relief, and CCA officials could celebrate success. Another contract was in place, this time with the Department of Homeland Security, ICE. As the federal government's principal immigration law enforcement arm, ICE is tasked with detaining people facing the possibility of forcible removal through the nation's immigration court system. Except for when ICE officers mistakenly pick up a U.S. citizen, which does happen. Everyone locked up on behalf of ICE is either a migrant waiting to learn whether she will be allowed to remain in the United States, or a migrant already ordered removed, awaiting the next available one-way spot on an airplane or bus. But unlike the Bureau of Prisons, ICE does not imprison to punish. It imprisons to give the federal government time to decide who gets to be in the United States and who does not. This isn't punishment, courts tell us. It's just deciding where on the map people should stand. Well, they should stand at the same facility where others were being punished not too long before. Well, politics and profits are the reasons why we lock up people, but they're not reasons that we should lock up anyone. And that's why in the end of the book, I call for abolishing immigration prisons, which I admit is not at all a small task. But it's also not impossible, as I said earlier. To begin with, it's been done before. Most people know something about Ellis Island, and when we think of Ellis Island, we think of it as that place that welcomed generations of newcomers to the United States. Well, it did that. But it was also an immigration prison with an ironic view of the Statue of Liberty. The anarchist Emma Goldman spent time there. The singer for the Metropolitan Opera, Ezio Pinza, did too. A little boy named George Zimmerman was born there, a different George Zimmerman. Just like today. In the 1950s, immigration prisons like the one on Ellis Island were said to protect us from ungodly dangers. Today, it's terrorists and it's gangs. Back then, it was communism. The Soviet Union was recovering from the immense pounding that it had taken during World War II. The Cold War was beginning, and that little speck of land off the coast of Manhattan was supposed to keep us safe from people like a woman named Ellen Knopf. Ellen Knopf is somebody whose story I find fascinating, so let me share just a few paragraphs of her story. She was born in Germany, but she spent part of Hitler's reign in Czechoslovakia. When war caught up with her, she headed to England as a refugee, where there she worked for the Royal Air Force and then the United States Army. While helping the Allied forces, she met U.S. citizen and Army veteran Kurt Knopf. After the war, the two married with the approval of the Army's commanding officer in Frankfurt, taking advantage of the War Brides Act, a special immigration procedure created by Congress precisely to let war veterans return to the United States with their new wives. Ellen arrived in New York on August 14, 1948. That's when the honeymoon turned into a nightmare, citing evidence that they refused to disclose even to the Knopfs. Immigration officials at Ellis Island were anything but welcoming. Ellen was excluded from the United States and sent to the restrictive quarters of the island's immigration station to fight for her freedom. As we approached Ellis Island, she later wrote, I could see that parts of it were enclosed by double wire fences, topped by barbed wire, and marked by what appeared to be watchtowers. These fenced-off areas were subdivided by more fences, which gave the whole place the look of a group of kennels. An official history published by the now-defunct INS described it as a grueling, detention-like penitentiary. Ellen wasn't even given a hearing at which she might claim her right to enter the United States or plead for mercy. Time and again, immigration officials denied Ellen's attempts to live freely in the United States with her husband. Time and again, they cited secret evidence that her admission would be prejudicial to the interests of the United States. Insistent, she fought her way all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where she found little comfort. The Constitution's promise of a fair hearing proved meaningless. And despite Justice Robert Jackson letting her off Ellis Island in May 1949, his colleagues weren't so sympathetic. For people like Ellen, hoping to enter the United States, the court ruled, Congress can create any procedure it likes. Whatever the procedure authorized by Congress is, it is due process as far as an alien denied entry is concerned, the court wrote in January 1950. The next month, Ellen was back on the island, and 8 decades later, courts continue relying on this line to deny all but the most limited procedural protections to migrants who have not been inspected and legally authorized to enter the United States. By the 1950s, when Ellen Knopf was spending time in this kennel-like facility, these days we might call this a perrera. As those of you who follow news about Border Patrol stations are familiar with that term. By the 1950s, the Ellis Island facility it was in bad shape, so it needed to be repaired or replaced or discarded. And in the White House was the war hero turned Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower. And no one had to tell Dwight Eisenhower about the dangers that the United States faced in the aftermath of World War II. And yet, instead of fixing up the Ellis Island prison, Eisenhower chose to shut it down. On November 11, 1954, the very first Veterans Day, Eisenhower's Attorney General, a man named Herbert Brownell, presided over a naturalization ceremony at Ebbets Field, home of the old Brooklyn Dodgers. And while there, he announced the government's new position. He said, today the little island between the Statue of Liberty and the skyline and piers of New York seems to have served its purpose. A few days later, the New York Times was reporting on this new policy, and it wrote, "The last detained alien, a Norwegian seaman who had overstayed his shore leave, was a passenger on the Battery-bound ferry." The United States government knew who this Norwegian seaman was. His name was Arne Peterson. The United States government knew that he had had permission to enter the country to work, and then he was supposed to leave. And the United States government knew that he had not left. And the United States government knew where he was. He was in their custody, inside that Ellis Island prison. And it was the United States government that let him out, put him on a ferry into Manhattan, and none of us, not the United States government or anyone else, knows what happened to Arne Peterson after that. So if the Cold War was not enough to stop Eisenhower from shutting down immigration prisons, then I think that it's time for us, all these years later, to be equally courageous. I think we have to stop constraining our vision of what is deemed possible. We hear a lot about what's not possible. It's not possible to change the way that we do things. It's not possible to prod Congress into doing anything about immigration. And if it's not possible to change anything, then what's the point of trying? What's the point of imagining the impossible? Well, I think it's fitting in times like these to remember the words of a man who knew how to blow fire into words, James Baldwin. I start the book with Baldwin's prodding words toward the end of The Fire Next Time, his famous essay. He writes, "I know that what I am asking is impossible, but in our time, as in every time, the impossible is the least that one can demand." We have to ask for the impossible, because we know what happens if we do not alter course. Anyone who follows the news can rattle off many reasons to be sad about the state of the world. And that's certainly true of immigration policies in the United States today. Instead of getting mired in this despair, I think there are a few steps that we can all take to help push our country toward a future that, at least when it comes to the lack of immigration prisons, looks a little bit more like our past. First, join forces with your courageous neighbors, several of which are sitting in this room with us tonight. Here in Seattle, that includes people like La Resistencia. For many years, La Resistencia has focused on shutting down the Northwest Detention Center, that facility that ICE recently renamed, but that continues to lock up migrants. I've admired the work that La Resistencia has been doing for many, many years. They're among the most courageous, most cutting-edge advocates who are thinking critically and acting fearlessly about immigration prisons. They're right here. They're your neighbors. Earlier today, I had the opportunity to chat with them and chat with members of One America who are committed to shutting down your local immigration prison. And second, vote. But don't just vote reflexively. Immigration prisons didn't start in January 2017 when Donald Trump meandered into the White House. And they won't end whenever Donald Trump leaves the White House. Immigration prisons were born with bipartisan support, and they grew with bipartisan support. There were more people locked up in immigration prisons than ever before under President Barack Obama, until President Trump. So Republicans need to be reminded that this is a costly experiment in depriving people of liberty. And Democrats could stand to be reminded that immigration prisons do not promote public safety. And it doesn't matter whether there's a private company running them or a local government doing so. Immigration prisons are always violent. Always. So I wrote Migrating to Prison, America's obsession with locking up immigrants, precisely to shine a light out of this whirlpool of misery. This is a book born from a profound commitment to hope, just like James Baldwin tells us to do. So I implore you to join me in that hope and to take actions that might make that hope into reality. Thank you.
So we are going to have a Q&A period for about 20 minutes. I will ask that you please come up to the mic since we are recording this for various reasons, and speak clearly into the microphone. And also please keep your questions as brief and concise as possible so that we can get to as many people as we can. Thanks so much.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I wrote this down. Can you talk about the relationship between immigration, prisons, and climate change? I know more and more migrants from Central America are seeking respite from the effects of climate change, especially in that area. Do you feel like this influx in climate refugees will bolster countries' current stance on immigration prisons, or perhaps have the opposite effect? Thank you.
Yeah, as more people are displaced by the economic and environmental impacts of climate change, then we can expect more people to leave wherever it is that they call home. And given long-standing migratory patterns, long-standing relationship between the United States and many countries around the world, but most pronounced countries in Central America. I think what we're seeing now with migrants from Central America making their way to the United States is only likely to increase. And if what we do is decide that the proper course of action for the United States is to respond to that Central American migration with the harsh edge of the options that are available to it through prisons, and if we decide that now, then there's no reason why we wouldn't decide that when more people are starting to come. So I think rather than wait for those impacts to get worse, I think the time is now to start thinking hard about what the proper immigration policy response is in that future that sadly seems to be coming.
Can you talk about Trump's policies of now keeping migrants in Mexico, what impact that is having on migration and just the conditions?
Yeah, they call it the Migrant Protection Protocol. There's a policy that the Trump administration put into place with regard to asylum seekers that requires that folks wait out the process of requesting asylum in Mexican border towns. Now, many of these are Mexican border towns with which I have a lifelong familiarity. Places where I was visiting frequently as a child and as a younger adult. So these are places that for me are very important on a personal level. But they're also places that I've seen transform. In many ways, some of these communities are really quite dangerous, and certainly more so when you are a member of a vulnerable group, like a person who's made your way there, fleeing persecution, fleeing violence, and so what we're seeing is that in communities along the Texas border, there are lots of encampments, tent encampments along the sides of bridges leading into Texas, and I think the hopeful side of this is that there are lots of good people in these communities for whom migration isn't a scary phenomenon about somebody else somewhere else, but it's these are people like me who for whom migration is a personal story, maybe a story they didn't live themselves individually, but one that is in their family, one that's in their community. And so there are lots of advocates in these communities who have responded to the Trump administration's policy initiatives by doing what they can, providing food and clothing and blankets. For a while, there were school lessons happening on a bridge for kids, all done by volunteers, all done in one of the poorest parts of the United States. So certainly people who could use support, whether that's through sweat or through financial support.
In California, they passed a law to prohibit private detention centers. And can you talk about what they're doing in California? Are they just letting the people out, or what is happening?
Yeah, so the governor of California a few months ago signed a law that goes into effect actually in January 1st. And the goal is to make it impossible for private prison corporations to operate, and there's a sort of a gradual scale down a process. But that's the end. That's very clearly the end goal. I mean, no one's denying that. And so of course, what this means for private prison corporations is that they need to think strategically about how to maintain their business. And so what we saw in I think it was something like 5 days after the governor signed that bill, ICE actually issued no bid contracts for four, I think it was 4 facilities that already operate, to see whether they could get somebody who was interested in extending the contract. Well, it won't surprise you that the very same people who were interested in extending the contract were the very same people who already had a contract. And the reason they did this, I mean, it seems clear to me. This is not what ICE says, but it seems clear to me that if you do this 5 days after this governor signs a law that's into effect that says these facilities have to shut down whenever their contract ends. Well, if you renew their contract for another 5-year period, I mean, you're just buying time, right? And so ICE seems to be a receptive partner with the private prison corporations to try to extend as long as possible the period of time that these existing facilities can continue to operate in sort of a business as usual model. But we'll see. We'll see what the end result will be. One concern that activists often raise is, does this mean that folks are just going to end up getting transferred to someplace else? Maybe, but I think from my perspective is that this is a way of raising awareness of the fact that this population of people exists, that somebody is profiting handsomely from human bondage, and also suggests that there are levers that can be pulled to raise the cost of engaging in these business practices.
I found it very telling when you were highlighting the politically convenient distinction between criminalization of migrants versus, family migrants, as well as the claim of the Bureau of Prisons to be interested in detaining migrants who had broken the law versus ICE's claim of detaining migrants in terms of trying to decide whether or not they should be deported, and the reality that those categories are very blurred. And my question is, to the extent that the abolition of migrant detention centers is successful, what do you think the risk or likelihood is of efforts to extend the criminalization aspect in order to try to sort of bolster the ability to detain people who are crossing the border?
Yeah, well, I'd say that long before the abolition of private prisons, long before the headway that advocates here in Washington have made in order against immigration prisons that are operated by public entities, long before any of that ever rose to be successful, the criminalization of migrants had already started. So do I think that will be used as an excuse to increase or to continue pushing that trend upward? Yeah. But I think we've if you look at the data about the criminal prosecution of immigration crimes, we see that going back to the last few years of the George W. Bush administration, that number started growing pretty significantly. Not because there was a new crime on the books, there wasn't. Illegal entry and legal reentry, they've been on the books since 1929. So almost a century, and they weren't used really almost ever until the last few years of the Bush administration, and that continued under President Obama, and it certainly has continued under President Trump. So I think the answer to your question is we're already there.
Hi. I'm curious whether your research has led you to examples of other countries that are destinations for asylum seekers and how they process incoming migrants without using the type of detention system that we have here.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is important for me never to forget is the impact that the U.S. has on other countries. So I wrote a lot of the book actually in Slovenia, and it's a sort of case you're not immediately able to put Slovenia on the map. It's northeast of Italy, south of Austria, and one of the things I learned while doing this work, while writing this book there, and talking to people about it was everyone's interested in what's happening in the U.S. In part because of the economic and military footprint that we still have, but in part because we still legitimate a lot of conduct. If it's acceptable for the U.S. to do it, then it's acceptable for others to do it. And so other countries with governments that have tendencies toward to adopt harsh approaches to migrants look to the U.S. model, not necessarily, not always for money, although we certainly do see that. We see that with regard to the Mexican government in particular recently, but oftentimes just as a political example or an intellectual example of what is an appropriate course of action, an acceptable course of action. And so, yeah, we do see that the UK is increasing its confinement of migrants. We see in Australia similar situation, in Europe. We see pressure from the EU towards some of the smaller countries along the periphery of the EU to try to do some of the same, and so just because so we're not necessarily alone, we do more of it by far, but just because we're in plentiful company doesn't mean we're in good company.
Hi. So the Trump administration has proposed and I believe tabled a push to brand Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations. And I was wondering if you could comment on what implication that has for people who move through Mexico and might encounter those cartels, who might seek an immigration benefit in the U.S. And then more broadly, I'm wondering if you have any advice on how we can push to disaggregate national security interests from immigration policy, because it seems that most of the most inhumane immigration policy changes have been made in the name of national security.
Yeah. So I think the answer to your question about the cartels being designated as terrorist organizations is somewhat answered by the fact that it's been tabled. It would make it harder to deny asylum claims, in particular by folks who are fleeing from these organizations. Now, I've learned my lesson under the Trump administration. Just because it's harder to do something doesn't mean that they won't, right? I won't put it past them to decide that somebody is fleeing from a terrorist and yet not deserving of our protection, right? So that's just the reality we're living in. When it comes to your question about national security and immigration, yeah, that certainly is true. A lot of harsh immigration law reforms and policy responses do come very directly from concerns about national security. In 1996, after the Oklahoma City bombing, despite the fact that it was two very white men a group of very white men who committed that atrocity, some of the legislation that results from Congress, it directly affects immigration law and makes it easier to find yourself locked up and harder to get out. That said, I think there's actually hope in the past. the Eisenhower administration, national security was the justification for Ellen Knopf being locked up in that facility, and she wasn't the only one who was in that Ellis Island facility for that very reason. The government insisted for years, we can't tell you this. You are so dangerous to us, Ms. Knopf, that if we just tell you why you're dangerous, that's gonna bring the whole thing down. Right? It turns out, so she was able to get enough. She would mount a PR campaign, got support from a bunch of newspaper editorial boards and members of Congress. And they finally, despite the Supreme Court saying, look, the government doesn't have to give her a hearing at all, period. They actually convinced the Attorney General to give her a hearing, just for political reasons only. Turns out, the evidence against her was really flimsy. The government eventually, the Attorney General actually released her. And it turns out they got divorced. So, I mean, this was a stressful time, like the beginning of their relationship, and she was locked up for a long part of it. So, I don't wish this on anyone. But what it shows is that even in at least in that moment when a national security was at the forefront of everyone's mind, right? The threat that the Soviet Union presented to the United States was very real. Very real. And Eisenhower certainly knew that. And yet we were able to disaggregate that. And so I don't know, maybe there's something to be said about the courageousness of Dwight Eisenhower. I'm not convinced that he was that special. I think there must be someone among us who also has the courage to think hard about whether it makes sense to do this and to simply categorically point to the threat of national security. That seems overly simplified to me.
Hi, thank you for your work. 2 questions. One, can we determine how many centers of detention there are combined using the motels and the nursing homes and the city and county jails, as well as the direct ICE detention centers? And then the second question, apart from writing amazing books, what actions, such as direct action or legislation or the hunger strikes by the prisoners themselves, what do you think will have the most impact toward closing down the detention centers?
Thank you. So, how many facilities? That's a hard one to answer. Largely because the number changes a lot. ICE, a lot of the facilities that ICE in particular, ICE and the U.S. Marshals use are county jails. So it rents bed space essentially from county sheriff's departments that run county jails. And in many of them, it actually houses a fairly small number of people. So the facility here in Tacoma is actually an outlier, right? It's about 1,500 beds, and so that makes it one of the largest in the entire network, and that's all it does too, right? Whereas county jails, what they're supposed to do primarily is to lock up for a short period of time people who are arrested on suspicion of some criminal activity or who have been punished to a few months up to a year, most generally for some crime. And so it's actually hard to keep track from year to year, and so I hesitate to give you a good number on that. But the population overall hovers in the 400,000 to 500,000 range of people per year, and that to me that's the number I tend to use more frequently because I think it's more meaningful than just the number of facilities where some of them might have held one person, right, or 2 people. What actions? Organizing. I think community organizing is the most important thing. I don't think it's lobbying Congress. I don't think it's lobbying the president. This is a policy with bipartisan support. So, I mean, clearly right now, there's no point in lobbying the president. But as I said before, President Obama presided over the largest immigration prison population in the history of the U.S. until Trump, right? And so for a while, at the beginning of his administration, maybe there was an argument to be made that this was a political calculation to try to bring Republicans to the negotiating table. Okay, I mean, that was a difficult to swallow argument, but in the first couple of years, but it became pretty evident after a while that the Republicans weren't interested in negotiating with Obama on immigration, right? And yet the policy continued. And so I think some high-level Obama officials actually believed it. And Joe Biden's comments recently, when he was challenged by an activist on the Obama administration's record, I think reflects that when he said, paraphrasing, basically something like, "Go vote for Trump." Right? That's the response of somebody who actually thinks that what they were doing was the right course of action. So for me, it's the most fruitful avenue of advocacy is not in the courtrooms. It's not in the halls of Congress. I think it's actually organizing communities, like some of the folks here in the Pacific Northwest have been doing for years.
This will be our last question.
Hi. Can you?
Hi.
Hello. Can you speak to what you see as the most credible arguments against closing the immigration prisons, or those that are closest to being credible, and how you think best to counter those?
Yeah, I think the hardest arguments to deal with are the people who don't have a chance of winning a claim to stay in the U.S. And the reality is that there are a lot of those people. We often hear that migrants should get in line. For lots of people, poor people in particular, there is no line to get into. And so I think for those folks, oftentimes the best that I could do as a lawyer is just say, look, there's nothing. There's no claim I can make on your behalf. So save your money, and go back to wherever you're gonna get deported to, and do whatever it is you're gonna do, right? Which often meant coming back, trying again to come back. I think the response for those folks is that we do need to align immigration law with the version of the political community that we currently are, not the version of the political community that we imagined ourselves being at one point. And because what I'm asking for is to dream of the impossible, then I actually think it's pretty realistic that by the time that we're ready as a nation to shut down immigration prisons, we'll also be ready to radically reform the avenues by which people can come into the United States. These things aren't divorced from one another. They operate in tandem with one another. So thank you all very much for coming out here tonight.